A multi-billion-dollar spacecraft is tumbling out of control in the freezing vacuum of space. 3 astronauts are running out of oxygen. Fast. And the only person on Earth with the mathematical solution to save them is a skinny, 16-year-old black boy from the projects. But instead of listening, the arrogant lead engineer slams his hand down on the desk, his eyes narrowing with absolute disgust. And he barks,
"Get your poor charity case hands away from my console, mascot!" I'll go stand behind the velvet rope where people like you belong and let the real credentialed geniuses handle the spacecraft.
The boy, his name is Jalen, does not flinch. He just clutches his grandfather's old slide rule inside his cheap button-down shirt, holding himself calm and dignified, while the whole room bursts into cruel, mocking laughter. That arrogant expert would rather watch 3 human beings burn alive in the atmosphere than admit that a poor kid from Gary, Indiana, is the smartest mind in the room. But here is what that gatekeeper did not realize. Their expensive software is about to crash. The experts are about to run completely out of answers. And in exactly 29 minutes, this same man is going to be forced to drop every ounce of his pride, turn around, and beg this exact boy to save those dying souls. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He is about to find out. Men, that line, a kid like you feel that one land somewhere under the ribs. Don't you? You have heard it before. Maybe not in those exact words, but you have heard the shape of it. The smile that is not a smile. The standards that only ever seem to apply to certain people. This is Calvin Boone, and you are watching Witness, the channel where I go digging in the stories of the people this country took one look at, decided did not count, and tried to forget. The folks the powerful bet would never amount to anything, and the exact day they were proven wrong, in front of everybody, with the receipts on the table. So pull up a chair, put the phone down for 1 second, because that man, Preston Vance, Caltech, 14 years of flight experience, the kind of resume that opens any door in America. That man was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life, and 3 astronauts were going to be hanging in the balance while he learned it. Let me take you back. Not to that control room. Not yet. Let me take you back to a 3rd-floor apartment in the projects on the east side of Gary, Indiana, where an old man kept a slide rule in a drawer like it was a holy thing. Gary, Indiana, used to be a city that built the spine of America, the steel that went into the bridges, the cars, the skyscrapers. A lot of it came off the mill floors right there on the lakefront. And then, the way these things go, the work left. The jobs went somewhere cheaper. The mills shut their gates one by one, and the city emptied out around the bones of what it used to be. Whole blocks of houses standing empty with the windows gone. Weeds coming up through the sidewalks. And a wind off Lake Michigan in October that goes straight through whatever you are wearing and finds the part of you that is tired. That is where Jalen Brooks grew up. 16 years old. 6 foot already. All elbows and quiet. He lived with his grandfather, Walter Brooks, in a unit on the 3rd floor of a housing project, with a radiator that knocked all night and a kitchen window that looked out on a shuttered tool and die shop across the street. Jalen's mother, Walter's daughter, passed when Jalen was 7. Cancer. The fast and cruel kind. The kind that does not give a family time to get ready. His father had left before that, before Jalen was old enough to keep a clear picture of him. So it came down to the 2 of them, an old man and a boy, a retired machinist with a bad heart, and a kid with a mind like a furnace. Now, Here is the thing you have to understand about Walter Brooks, because the whole story turns on it. Walter was not an ordinary man who happened to have a gifted grandson. Walter was a genius who happened to be born in the wrong year, in the wrong skin, in a country that had already decided what he was allowed to become. Back in 1961, Walter Brooks was the smartest kid anybody at his high school had ever seen. He could do orbital math in his head before most people even knew what an orbit was. When the country went space crazy after the Russians put Sputnik up there, Walter read everything he could get his hands on. He filled notebooks. Actual notebooks. You could still find them in a box in that apartment, with trajectory calculations, fuel equations, re-entry angles. All of it worked out by hand, in pencil. A teenager teaching himself rocket science in a steel town, because something in him reached up at the sky and would not let go. He applied to the engineering program at a big aerospace firm that was hiring like crazy in those years. They needed minds. The country needed minds. And Walter Brooks had one of the best minds that ever walked into that building. They gave him a job sweeping floors. When he asked, politely, with his notebooks under his arm, the way you were supposed to ask back then, when he asked about the drafting work, the engineering track, the rooms where they actually designed the things that flew, the man behind the desk looked at him and said, and I want you to hear this exactly the way Walter remembered it for the rest of his life. Son, the men in those rooms have to be a certain kind of person. You understand? It is not personal. It is just how it is. It is just how it is. Walter spent the next 40 years on the factory floor, a machinist, a tool and D-man, one of the best in the Midwest. Everybody said so. He cut the parts. He shaped the metal that went up into machines designed by men in rooms he was never allowed to enter. For 40 years, Walter Brooks built the bones of other people's dreams with his own 2 hands, and he carried that certain kind of person around in his chest like a piece of shrapnel that never worked its way out. But here is what they could not take from him. They could not take the love of it. And when his grandson turned out to have the same furnace in his head, when 7-year-old Jalen started asking why the moon did not fall down, and Walter pulled the old notebooks out of the box and started to explain, something in that old man came back to life that had been quiet for half a century. Have you ever watched a man pour everything he was never allowed to be into a child? Like he is trying to launch the kid into a sky he himself never got to touch. That is what Walter did. Every evening, at that kitchen table, under a hanging bulb, with the radiator knocking, he taught Jalen the way you hand down a religion. The slide rule came out of the drawer. The pencils came out. And the 2 of them, the old man and the boy, worked problems together until Jalen passed him. And Walter would tell you, with tears in his eyes, that the proudest moment of his entire life was the night his 14-year-old grandson found a mistake in Walter's own work and corrected it. Gently, the way Walter had taught him to correct a man. Without making him feel small, Jalen took it from there. The library on Broadway had free Wi-Fi and a cracked old desktop computer in the corner that nobody else wanted to use. Jalen used it every single day after school until they kicked him out at closing. He found the free university lectures, the real ones, the same courses they teach to graduate students, put online for anybody in the world to watch. He worked through them, one after another, taking notes in a spiral notebook with the cover half torn off. He found the public technical archives, thousands of real engineering reports from the actual space program, declassified and posted online for free, written by the people who put human beings on the moon. He read them the way other kids read comic books, and he found the flight simulators, the free ones, and then the cheap ones, and then a serious orbital mechanics program that some university had released to the public. On a second-hand laptop with a crack across the screen and a battery that only held a charge if you held the cord at exactly the right angle, Jalen Brooks taught himself to fly spacecraft. Rendezvous, docking, deorbit burns, re-entry corridors. Thousands of hours. He flew missions that did not exist, solved emergencies that had not happened, and got so good that the simulated disasters stopped being able to kill him. He did not have a tutor. He did not have a fancy school. He had a dead-broke library computer, a cracked laptop, a stack of free knowledge that this country had, almost by accident, left lying around where a poor kid could reach it, and an old man at a kitchen table who believed in him with the whole force of a life that had been denied. That was the whole arsenal. That was everything Jalen Brooks had. It turned out to be enough. The flyer was taped to the wall outside the high school guidance office, half hidden behind a cheerleading tryout notice. And Jalen almost walked right past it. The Halloway National STEM Prize, open to any high school student in the country. Submit an original solution to one of 3 posted engineering challenges. Grand prize, a 1-week mentorship, and a guest day inside the Mission Control Center of Meridian Aerospace. During a live crewed spaceflight, Jalen stood in that hallway and read it 3 times. Meridian was one of the new private companies, the ones actually flying people now, running missions up to a commercial station called Halcyon that orbited 400 kilometers over everyone's heads. Real astronauts, real spacecraft, the real rooms, the rooms with a certain kind of person in them. One of the challenges was an orbital trajectory problem, anasteone, the kind that was supposed to take a graduate student a week and supposed to scare a high schooler off entirely. Jalen solved it in 2 nights. And then, because he was Walter Brooks's grandson, and Walter had taught him that you do not just answer the question, you understand it. He did not stop at the answer. He found a more efficient solution than the one the problem seemed to want. He saved fuel. The official answer key wasted. He wrote it up in his torn cover notebook, typed it on the library computer, and sent it in without telling anybody, because he did not want his grandfather's hopes up over a thing he was probably going to lose. 6 weeks later, a letter came. Walter brought it up the 3 flights of stairs and set it on the kitchen table and made Jalen open it, because his hands were shaking too bad, and he did not want the boy to see. Jalen had won. First place, out of 11,000 entries from every state in the Union. A 16-year-old from the projects in Gary, Indiana, working on a cracked laptop, had submitted the best solution in America. The old man read the letter 4 times. And then Walter Brooks sat down at that kitchen table, in that apartment, under that bulb, with the radiator knocking, and he put his face in his hands, and he cried like a man who had been holding his breath for 50 years and was only now, finally, allowed to let it out. You are going to stand in the room, he said, when he could talk again. You hear me? You are going to walk into the room they kept me out of, and you are going to stand in it like you were always supposed to be there. Because you were. Baby. You always were. He pressed something into Jalen's hand. It was warm from his pocket. It was the slide rule. The old one. The holy thing from the drawer. Take it with you, so a little piece of me gets in there too. Jalen put it in his shirt pocket. He would keep it there the whole trip. And 29 minutes into the worst day of his life, that little piece of his grandfather was going to be the only thing in the room keeping him on his feet. What would you carry into the room they kept your people out of? And how steady could you keep your hands when you finally got there? Meridian Aerospace's Mission Control Center was 300 miles and a whole universe away from the projects in Gary. It rose up out of a Texas business park. all glass and clean white concrete. Security gates and a flagpole and landscaping that somebody paid to water. Inside, the air was cool and dry, and it smelled like new carpet and coffee. There were screens everywhere, rows of consoles, each one with 3 monitors and a headset, manned by people in company polo shirts, who all seemed to know exactly where they were going and exactly how important they were. Jalen walked in wearing his ironed shirt and his good shoes and his grandfather's slide rule in his pocket. And for the first 10 minutes, nobody could figure out what to do with him. A woman at the front desk asked if he was looking for his parent. A man in the elevator asked if he was part of the cleaning crew that came on Saturdays. Not cruelly, just automatically. The way the world automatically decides what a tall black teenager in a cheap shirt must be. And it is never, ever, the winner of the National Engineering Prize. Here, as our honored guest, Jalen corrected each of them politely. He had had a lot of practice being polite, while people decided what he was. The one person who treated him like a human being was a young flight controller named Devin Price. Devin was maybe 26. Sharp. Recently hired. One of the only other black faces on that whole floor. And when he found Jalen standing alone and a little lost by the visitor's rope, he came right over and shook his hand and said, "You are the kid. The Holloway winner. Man, I read your solution. They circulated it internally, that fuel optimization thing you did on the trajectory. That was clean. That was real clean. Half the people in this room could not have done that." Jalen did not know what to say. Somebody in this building had read his work and called it clean. He had not known how badly he needed to hear that until he heard it. "Stigbime," Devin said. "I will walk you through what is happening. Today is a good day to be here. Actually, we have got a live one." He pointed up at the big board. There was a spacecraft up there. Right now, 400 kilometers over their heads, moving at 28,000 kilometers an hour, was the Meridian capsule, Aurora 1, docked to Halcyon Station, with 3 human beings aboard who were scheduled to undock in a few hours and come home. Devin ran down the crew like they were family, because to him, they kind of were. Commander Yvette Sims, 48 years old, a veteran, former Air Force test pilot, 2 previous space flights, the steadiest hands in the Corps, and, Devin said this with a particular quiet pride, one of a very small number of black women who had ever commanded an American spacecraft. There was a whole lot of little girls back home watching that woman fly, Devin said, including my niece, pilot Dan Holt, 35. First flight, brand new baby at home. A daughter, 6 weeks old, that he had been carrying a photo of around the station and showing to everybody. He had named her after his own grandmother, mission specialist Priya Anand, a scientist, the one who actually did the experiments the whole mission was for. 3 people, up there, trusting that the rooms full of certain kinds of people down here would bring them home. And then Preston Vance walked onto the floor, and the temperature dropped. Preston Vance was the lead flight dynamics officer. In plain English, that meant he was the man responsible for where the spacecraft went and how it got there, the trajectories, the burns, the math of the whole flight. He was deputy to the flight director herself. He was on the technical side of that room, close to the top of the mountain, and he had earned it. That is the part people always want to leave out of these stories. So let me put it in. Vance was good. Caltech for undergrad. MIT for the doctorate. 14 years. Flying real missions. A wall of commendations. The man was not a fraud. He was the real thing. He was also a gatekeeper to the marrow of his bones. and he had built an entire identity around the idea that the people in his rooms were there because they were the best. And the people who were not in his rooms were not there because they were not clean. Simple. A closed loop that conveniently made everyone already inside the room a genius. And everyone outside it deservedly out. He called it merit. He said the word merit the way some men say a prayer. He had been against the Holloway Guest program from the start. He thought it was public relations dressed up as opportunity. He had said so in meetings. And when he came onto the floor that day and saw a 16-year-old standing at the visitor's rope in a cheap button-down, his whole face arranged itself into something that was technically a smile. "Ah," he said, loud enough for the floor to hear. "The mascot is here." A couple of people laughed, the nervous kind of laugh. The kind people do, when the powerful man makes a joke, and they want him to know they are on his team. That is when he walked over and gave the speech. The one about the velvet rope, about standing where people like you belong, about smiling for the cameras and not touching anything and not saying a word. And Jalen took it the way he had learned to take it. Steady. "Yes, sir. I can manage that." With the slide rule in his pocket and his grandfather's voice somewhere in the back of his head, but Vance was not quite done. Because a man like that, when he has got an audience and a target, he likes to make sure everyone understands the lesson. So he turned it into a little show. "Tell you what," Vance said, "since you are our big prize winner, our genius, let us see it. Quick one. The capsule is up there docked to the station. We want to bring it home. Roughly now. I am not asking for the whole flight plan. What is the basic shape of a deorbit? In your own words, educate the room. It was a trap." Of course. Whatever the kid said, Vance was going to find it lacking. That is how the trap works. It is not built so you can pass. It is built so the man can be seen being right. Jalen knew it was a trap. You could see him know it. And for 1 second, you could see the easy way out sitting right there. "I do not know." "Sir." Mumble it. "Look at your shoes." Give the man his moment. Get through the day. He did not take the easy way out. He stood up a little straighter. And in a calm, clear voice, in front of that entire floor, he said, "You fire the engine against your direction of travel, to bleed off speed. You are not really aiming the spacecraft at the ground. You are lowering the bottom of your orbit until it dips far enough into the atmosphere that drag does the rest. The hard part is not slowing down. The hard part is the angle you come in at. There is a corridor, maybe a degree or two wide, come in too shallow, and you skip off the top of the atmosphere like a flat stone off a pond. And you do not get a second try before your air runs out. Come in too steep. And you build up heat and load faster than the shield can take it. And the vehicle comes apart. So the entire job, really, is hitting a 2-degree window from a couple 100 kilometers up, while you are going 25 times the speed of sound. Sir. The floor went quiet. It was not a high schooler's answer. It was not even a good undergraduate's answer. It was the answer of someone who had flown it, who had skipped off the atmosphere in a simulator and watched his crew die and learned the lesson in his stomach 1,000 times. On a cracked laptop in Gary, Indiana, Devon Price was grinning. A couple of the older engineers had turned in their chairs, and Preston Vance, for just a flicker, for just a half second, looked surprised, looked thrown. The kid was not supposed to be able to do that, but a man who has built his whole self around a closed loop cannot afford to let a thing like that intact. So he did what gatekeepers do. He moved the goalposts. Vance said. Memorized a documentary. Did we? That is the thing about the internet. It makes everybody sound like they know something. You can recite the words. Sûr. But reciting and understanding are two very different animals. And in this room, that difference is the difference between life and death. So, he clapped his hands together, dismissing it, dismissing him. Zutetrik. Now, go stand behind the rope, mascot, and let the people who actually went to school handle the spacecraft. He turned and walked back toward his console, and he had no way of knowing. None. That he had just done in miniature the exact thing that was about to nearly kill 3 people. He had been handed something true, by someone he had decided did not count, and he had thrown it away because of who it came from. He was going to do it once more that day. And the second time, it would cost 3 lives. Almost down to the very last second. Have you ever watched a man so certain of his own merit that he could not tell the difference between a child and a genius standing in front of him? In the same body. Now here is the part of the story that should keep you up at night. Jalen did exactly what he was told. He stood behind the rope. He was quiet. He watched. But watching, for Jalen Brooks, was never a passive thing. Walter had trained that out of him at the kitchen table. You do not just look at the numbers. Baby, you listen to what they are trying to tell you. And so Jalen stood behind that rope and he read every screen he could see. And his furnace of a mind started running the whole flight in parallel with the room. Quietly, the way it always did. Because it did not know how to stop, and about 40 minutes before undock, he saw something he did not like. There was a tracking display. Orbital debris. Space is full of junk now. Dead satellites. Spent rocket stages. 10,000 pieces of metal moving fast enough to punch through steel. And the whole job of a flight team is partly to know where all of it is, and make sure the spacecraft is never in the same place. At the same time as any of it, there was a conjunction warning on the board. A piece of debris was going to pass close to the undock corridor. The system had flagged it yellow. Close. But inside the official margin, acceptable. Proceed. Jalen looked at the numbers under the warning, and he ran them again in his head. And then he ran them a third time, and his stomach went cold, because the margin the system was using assumed the debris was on the track the catalog said it was on. But there had been a note, a small one, easy to miss, in a corner of the data feed. It said that this particular object had done an uncommanded maneuver 3 days earlier. A dead satellite venting leftover fuel, tumbling, nudging itself onto a slightly different path. And the conjunction math had not fully updated for it. The real margin was not comfortable yellow, by Jalen's red. The real margin was almost nothing. It was the kind of pass where, if you were even a little unlucky, the debris and the capsule were going to try to occupy the same cubic meter of space. At 28,000 kilometers an hour, a 16-year-old behind the visitor's rope had spotted, in his head, a hole in the safety margin of a multi-billion-dollar spaceflight. Now, what would you do? You are a guest. You have been humiliated in front of the whole room once already. You have been told, in plain words, to keep your mouth shut. The grown-ups have the badges and the degrees and the headsets. The system flagged it yellow, which means proceed, which means smarter people than you already looked at it and decided it was fine. Jalen Brooks did the hardest thing in this entire story, harder than the math that came later. He raised his hand, and he opened his mouth. He went to Devin first, quietly, the right way. That conjunction, the yellow one. Did the margin update for the maneuver 3 days ago? Because if it did not, I do not think that is a yellow. I think that is a lot closer than yellow. Devin frowned, looked at it. Let me. And to his credit, Devon Price, the one person on that floor who treated the kid like a person, took it seriously enough to walk it up the line. He brought it to the flight dynamics desk. He brought it to Vance, and Vance. God help him. Vance looked at where it had come from before he looked at what it was. The intern found something. Vance announced to the floor, dripping with it. The mascot is running conjunction analysis from behind the rope now. Sound the alarm. A couple of laughs. It is yellow. The system flagged it yellow. The system is $100 million of software. And it says, proceed. You want me to scrub a crude undock because a high schooler has a feeling. Get him a juice box. And get him away from my desk. We are flying this mission. And that was that. The flight director, a woman named Dr. Catherine Mercer, who I am going to tell you a lot more about in a minute, was not on the floor for that exchange. She was in a back briefing room with the company's executives. By the time she came back out, the moment had passed. The warning had been waved off. The room had moved on. And the undock was, go. Jalen stood behind the rope. He had done everything right. He had seen the danger. He had raised it through the proper channel. He had been calm and exact and correct. And he had been laughed at and dismissed because of who he was, by a man who could not imagine that the answer might walk into the room wearing a cheap shirt. He stood there, and he watched the clock count down to undock, and he prayed to a God. He was not sure he believed in that he was wrong. He was not wrong. What is the cost? The real, measured, human cost of deciding in advance that certain people's warnings do not count. We are about to find out the exact number. The number is 3 lives, and it comes due in 11 minutes. Undock was clean. Aurora 1 backed away from Halcyon Station on its little thrusters, slow and graceful, and the floor relaxed, the way floors do. Holt, the new dad, made a joke over the comm loop about the view. Commander Sims ran her checklist in that flat, unhurried test pilot voice that makes everyone around her calmer just by existing. And then, 11 minutes after undock, as the capsule fired its thrusters to set up for the deorbit sequence, there was a sound on the comm loop that nobody in that room ever wants to hear. It was not a scream. Astronauts do not scream. It was Commander Sims's voice. And it was still flat and still calm. But it had a new thing under it. A tightness. And she said 4 words that turned the entire floor to ice. We have taken a strike. The debris, the yellow conjunction that had never really been yellow, a fragment. They would never recover it. I never see it. It was gone past at a speed that makes the word fast meaningless. Had clipped the aft end of the capsule. The service section, right where the thrusters and the propulsion and the life support all lived, for about 4 seconds. The whole control room stopped breathing. Then it exploded into motion. And the motion was controlled and trained and professional. And underneath all of it was raw fear. And I'm going to give you the picture as cleanly as I can, because you need to understand exactly how bad it was. So you understand exactly what the kid did. The strike had knocked out 2 of the 4 aft maneuvering thrusters, and worse, it had put a slow tumble into the spacecraft. The capsule was now rotating, lazily, in a way, and the 2 thrusters it had left could not cleanly stop it. And there was something else. The hit had cracked a line in the environmental system. The capsule was slowly venting its air. 3 astronauts, in a wounded, spinning spacecraft, were now watching their oxygen tick down on a gauge, and there was nothing they could do about the leak. No. Here is why all of that is a death sentence, if you cannot solve it. And I want to make it simple. To come home, Aurora 1 had to fire its main engine at exactly the right time, pointed exactly the right way. for exactly the right length to drop into that 2-degree re-entry corridor. The whole thing depends on the spacecraft being pointed precisely and held steady when the engine lights. But the spacecraft was tumbling, and the thrusters that were supposed to hold it steady were half gone. So when the computer tried to fly the deorbit burn it had been planning all along, the math was now wrong, because that burn assumed a healthy, stable vehicle, and what they had was a wounded, spinning one. Fire the planned, burn into a tumble, with a busted thruster set, and the thrust pushes off-axis. You do not hit the corridor. You miss it. You skip off into space and run out of air. Or you come in too steep and burn alive. And there was a clock. 2 clocks. Now, the cruelest part of orbital mechanics is that it does not care about your feelings and it does not negotiate. The geometry only lined up for a safe return for a window. Miss the window, and the next chance to come down, anywhere survivable, was hours away. And the capsule, leaking, did not have hours of air. Devon ran it twice and his face went the color of paper. Between the closing orbital window and the falling oxygen, they had, give or take, half an hour. Half an hour to compute. A brand new way to fly home, with half the spacecraft's hands tied behind its back. Or 3 people were going to die. On live telemetry, in front of the whole team, Vance took command of the technical fight. And again, credit where it is due. The man did not panic on the outside. He marshaled the room. He put the trajectory team on a recompute. He had them feeding the new vehicle state into the software to generate a corrected burn, and the software could not do it. It tried. It chewed on the problem. But the failure was ugly and non-standard. A specific tumble, a specific pair of dead thrusters, a shifted center of thrust, and the program kept failing to converge on a solution inside the time they had. It would run, and spit out a burn, and then somebody would check it, and the burn put them outside the corridor, on the steep side, on the burns up side. Run it again. Different inputs. Still no good. The clock ate 5 minutes, then 10, and then the software did the worst thing it could possibly do. Pushed past everything it was designed for. Fed contradictory data over and over. The whole flight dynamics computation suite locked up, and threw an error across every screen on the trajectory desk, and crashed. Their $100 million brain went dark. Right when they needed it most. You could feel the room start to come apart. Not loudly, quietly. The specific quiet of very smart, very trained people beginning to understand that their tools were not going to save these 3 human beings in time, and that they were going to have to stand here, in this clean, cool room, and listen to it happen. Up on the loop, Commander Sims's voice. Still flat. Still steady. Holding it together for her crew. Flight. Aurora 1. We are showing significant aft prop loss. An uncommanded rate. And a slow cabin depress. We are watching our oxygen up here. Confirm you are working a corrected deorbit. Because we are running low on time. And air. She knew. She knew exactly how bad it was. And she was being calm. Show that Holt, 35 years old, 6-week-old daughter at home, would not have to be the one to lose it. Vance keyed his mic and gave her the only thing he had. Aurora 1. Flight dynamics. We are working the solution. Stand by. Working the solution. Except they were not getting one. The software was dead. The team was stuck. And the clock kept running. And 16-year-old Jalen Brooks was standing behind the visitor's rope. And he had already solved it. I told you he had flown 1,000 emergencies on that cracked laptop. I told you the simulated disasters had stopped being able to kill him. This exact failure, a debris streak, a tumble, a degraded thruster set, a deorbit, you have to fly by hand around the damage. This was one Jalen had run more times than he could count. Not because he knew it was coming, because it was one of the hard ones. And Jalen Brooks, like his grandfather before him, had always run straight at the hard ones. From the second Sims, said we have taken a strike. Jalen's mind had been working it. And somewhere around the time the room's software locked up and died, he had it. Not a guess. Not a feeling. A solution. Clean and whole. Sitting finished in his head. The room was attacking it the wrong way. They were trying to compute one perfect main engine burn that accounted for all the damage. And the math of doing that, with a live tumble and a shifted thrust line, was exactly the thing that had just crashed their computer. It was the brute force approach. Powerful. And in the time they had left, hopeless. Jalen's approach was different. It was the kind of thing you only see when somebody understands the problem in their body. Not just on paper. First, you do not try to burn through the tumble. You kill the tumble first. And you do it. Not by fighting it with the two dead-side thrusters, but by using the small steering thrusters you have left in a specific staggered sequence, firing the good ones in a pattern that nulls the rotation around each axis. One at a time. Instead of all at once, it costs a little fuel and about 90 seconds, but it buys you a stable spacecraft. Then, and only then, you fly the main burn, but not the planned one. A split burn. 2 shorter burns instead of 1 long one, with the vehicle repointed in between. The timing and the length of each piece computed to compensate for the shifted thrust line from the lost thrusters. So the total ends up pushing the capsule exactly into the corridor, instead of off-axis. It threads the needle by sneaking up on it in 2 moves, instead of trying to slam it in 1. It was elegant. It was the kind of solution that makes other engineers, years later, say, and go quiet. And Jalen had it complete. The sequence, the timing, the lengths, the corridor it produced, sitting finished in his head, while the clock on the wall kept eating the crew's air, and the room kept failing, and he could not get a single person to listen to him, because he was the mascot. Behind the rope, have you ever known the answer? Known it, all the way down, with somebody's life on the line, and not been allowed to say it, because of who the world had decided you were. This is the moment. This is the whole story. Right here. Everything Walter Brooks was ever denied. Everything that man swallowed for 40 years on a factory floor. Every door that ever closed on a brilliant mind because of the color of the hand that knocked. All of it came down to this one room. This one clock. This one boy, with the answer in his head and a rope in front of him. He tried Devin first. Hard and fast and quiet. Devin. Devin. Listen to me. They are doing it wrong. And now the computer is gone. So they have got nothing. You cannot burn through the tumble. You null the rates first, with a staggered firing of the good thrusters. Then you fly a split burn to fix the thrust offset. 2 burns. Not 1. I have the timing. Devin, I have all of it. I have flown this exact failure. And Devin, bless this man forever. Devin looked at the kid's face, and Devin was scared. And Devin believed him. Slow down. Show me. And Jalen grabbed a marker off a side table and started writing the sequence on the back of a printout. Fast. Clean. the numbers flowing out of him. And Devon's eyes went wide. Because it was right. It was obviously right. It was the only thing in that room that looked like it could actually work. Devon stood up, with the printout in his hand, and his whole career on the line. And he walked it straight to the flight dynamics desk, into the teeth of the storm. And he said, loud, I have got a solution. Split burn. Null the rates first. The kid has it worked out by hand. And I think it closes. And that is when Preston Vance slammed his hand down on the desk. That is the moment from the very beginning of this story. The hand on the desk. The disgust. Get your poor charity case hands away from my console. Mascot. Go stand behind the velvet rope where people like you belong. And let the real, credentialed geniuses handle the spacecraft. He did not even look at the math. With his software dead. With 3 people leaking air 400 kilometers up. With no solution of his own anywhere in sight. This man looked at the back of that printout. Saw the handwriting was not his team's. It understood instantly where it had come from. And would rather watch 3 human beings burn alive than take the answer from a 16-year-old in a cheap shirt. That is what bias does at the very end of the line. It is not a feeling. It is not a manners problem. It is a thing that will let 3 people die in the sky, rather than admit the kid behind the rope is smarter than the man with the degrees. And it would have. It very nearly did. But there was one more person in that room, and she had just walked back onto the floor. Dr. Catherine Mercer had been the flight director at Meridian for 9 years, and a flight controller for 15 years before that. And the thing everyone said about her, the thing that was true, was that in a crisis, Kate Mercer got quieter. The worse it was, the lower her voice went, until in the very worst moments, she spoke so softly that the whole room had to lean in to hear. And that leaning in was its own kind of calm. She walked back onto the floor, took one look at the board. One look at the dead software. One look at the clock. One look at the faces of her team. And she understood, in about 4 seconds, that her people were losing, that the spacecraft was dying, that the crew was running out of air, that the computer was gone, and that she had about a quarter of an hour to find a miracle, or write 3 letters she would carry for the rest of her life. She heard the tail end of it. She heard Vance say, "Get your charity case hands away from my console." She saw Devon Price standing there, holding a printout with his jaw clenched. And she saw, behind the rope, a 16-year-old boy who was not crying, and was not panicking, and was looking at her, directly at her, across the whole floor, with an expression she would try to describe for years afterward and never quite manage. She said the closest word was certainty. The boy looked certain. In a room full of the most qualified people in the country, who had just run out of answers. The only person who looked like he knew exactly what to do was the kid they had told to keep quiet. Kate Mercer had not gotten where she was by ignoring the only certain face in a room full of fear. "Pritza," she said. "What have you got?" Vance turned. "Kate, it is nothing. It is the guest kid. He has been. I did not ask you." Preston. Quiet. Very quiet. "Price, what have you got?" And Devon Price held up the printout and said, "In a rush. A complete corrected deorbit solution. Null the body rates first. With a staggered firing of the surviving thrusters. Then a 2-part split burn. Computed to compensate for the thrust offset from the lost units. It puts them in the corridor. The math closes. Flight. I checked it. It closes. Whose math? A beat. Devon glanced at Jalen. His. The whole floor looked at the boy behind the rope. Now here is where you find out what a leader actually is. Because Kate Mercer had every reason in the world to do what Vance did. Her own deputy. A Caltech. Mit. 14-year veteran. Was telling her it was a child's homework. The safe. Defensible. Career-protecting move was to back her senior man. Keep trying to reboot the software. And pray. Nobody would ever fault a flight director for not betting 3 lives on a teenage guest's handwriting. Kate Mercer looked at the clock. She looked at the dead computer. She looked at her deputy, who had no solution, and a great deal of certainty about whose solution not to use. And she looked at the boy, and she made the call that saved 3 lives. She said 5 words, bring him to the desk. Vance actually stepped in front of her. Kate, you cannot be serious. He is a 16-year-old. This is a crude re-entry. If we fly some kids. And Kate Mercer turned and looked at Preston Vance. And she dropped her voice down to almost nothing. And she said the thing that every gatekeeper in the world needs to hear at least once. Preston, we do not have a solution. He does. I do not care if it came from a 16-year-old or a burning bush. I care if it is right. And the difference between you and me, right now, in this moment, is that I am willing to find out. And you are not. Step aside. That is an order. Preets. We get the boy a headset and a console. Move. The room moved. They brought Jalen Brooks out from behind the rope. And now, here is your number. 29 minutes. Write it down. Because that is exactly how long it had been. From the moment Preston Vance first told that boy to stand behind the velvet rope and keep his mouth shut, to the moment the same man, with the last of his pride breaking apart in his hands, stood at that desk with nothing left, watched the boy he had mocked sit down at a console, and heard himself say, "Horse," barely a whisper, to a 16-year-old from the projects, "Do it. Whatever you have got, just, please, bring them home." Have you ever watched a child walk through a door that was bolted shut against his grandfather for 50 years? Because for one moment, the only thing in the room that mattered was whether he was right. They sat Jalen at a console next to Devon, gave him a headset, and put 2 of the senior trajectory engineers on either side of him, to check every number he produced in real time, which was exactly right. You do not fly anything on faith. Not a child's, and not a Nobel laureate's. The deal was simple, and Kate Mercer said it out loud. He proposes. We verify. Every line. If it checks, we fly it. If it does not, we do not. Go. And then a 16-year-old boy from the projects in Gary, Indiana, with his grandfather's slide rule in his shirt pocket, sat down in the most important room in American spaceflight, with 3 people's lives and 3 people's air on the clock, and the whole team watching. And he went to work. He was calm. That is what undid everybody. They expected a kid in over his head, fumbling, second-guessing. What they got was a young man who had flown this exact nightmare 1,000 times in the dark, and knew every inch of it. He did not rush. He did not freeze. His voice over the loop was steady and clear, and he laid it out, step by step. And the 2 veteran engineers beside him started out skeptical, and within 4 minutes were just checking his work and finding it good. Finding it good. Finding it good. Their faces changing as they went. First, we know the rates. Jalen said, do not fight the tumble with the main system. Use the surviving steering thrusters in a staggered sequence. I will give you the firing order. Kill the pitch rate. Then the yaw. Then the roll. one axis at a time, so you do not waste fuel fighting yourself. That gets us a stable vehicle. Costs about 90 seconds. And a little gas. We have the gas. Barely. But we have it. The engineer on his left ran it. Looked up. The sequence nulls the rates. Flight. His stabilization solution works. It is good. Now the burn. Jalen said, the planned single burn does not work. Because with the two aft units gone, the thrust line is offset. So a long burn walks us off axis and out of the corridor on the steep side. So we do not do one burn. We do two. A split. First burn here. Numbers. Then we repoint. 2 degrees. This way. Then the second burn here. Numbers. And the offsets cancel. And the total drops us into the middle of the corridor instead of the edge, not the shallow edge, not the steep edge, the middle. I want the middle. We have no margin to spend. So I want them dead center. The engineer on his right ran the split burn. It took him 4 minutes that felt like 4 years. And then he sat back. And he took his glasses off. And he said, very quietly, to the whole room flight. The split burn solution puts Aurora 1 in the center of the entry corridor. Dead center. I have checked it twice. It is not just valid. It is better than anything we generated before the computer crashed. It spends less fuel. And it has more margin. He stopped, started again. Flight. I would fly this. I would fly this with my own family aboard. The room was silent. Kate Mercer looked at Jalen. You are certain? Jalen looked back at her. And he thought, just for a second, about his grandfather at the kitchen table. You do not just answer the question. You understand it. I have flown this failure 500 times. He said, I have killed this crew every way there is to kill them. This is the way they live. I am certain. Kate Mercer Keetermike, Aurora 1. Flight. We have your corrected deorbit solution. I am going to talk you through it. Commander Sims. I need you to trust me on the sequence. Because it is going to feel wrong before it feels right. We are going to null your rates with a staggered thruster firing the motor. Then fly a split burn. 2 burns. Stand by to copy. And Commander Yvette Sims. 48 years old. 2 flights. The steadiest hands in the Corps. Hanging in a tumbling. Leaking spacecraft 400 kilometers up. With a brand new father and a scientist depending on her. Commander Sims said. In that flat, unhurried voice. The bravest thing a person can say. Flight. Aurora 1. We trust you. Send it up. They sent it up. Jalen called the sequence. Devon relayed it. Sims flew it. The steering thrusters fired in the staggered order. Pitch. Then yaw. Then roll. And on the board, the tumble that had been spinning that capsule end over end slowed. And wobbled. And stopped. The spacecraft went still. Stable. Pointed. The whole room let out a breath. It had been holding for 20 minutes. And Jalen Brooks did not let out a breath. Because he knew the hard part had not started yet. Rates are nulled. The engineer confirmed. Vehicle is stable. May God. It worked. The vehicle is stable. First burn. Jalen said. Eyes on the clock. On the oxygen gauge ticking down on the crew's telemetry. On the geometry only he could fully see. On my mark. 3. 2. 1. Mark. The main engine lit. The first piece of the split burn. Short. Precise. Exactly as long as it was supposed to be. And then it cut off. Clean. Repoint. Jalen said. 2 degrees. There. Hold it. Hold it. Steady. Sims repointed the spacecraft. Second burn. On my mark. 3, 2, 1. Mark. The engine lit again. The second piece. And this was the one. This was the burn that either dropped them dead center in the corridor, or sent them skipping off into the dark to suffocate, or sent them in too steep to burn. And there was nothing left to do but watch the numbers come back and find out whether a 16-year-old from a city the country had given up on had just done what an entire room of the best engineers in America could not. The engine cut off. For a second, nobody on the floor moved. The data had to come down. The trajectory had to update. The board had to tell them whether those 3 people were going to live, and then the entry corridor display refreshed. And Aurora 1's predicted path settled onto the screen, and it came down right into the center of the window. Not the shallow edge, not the steep edge, dead center. Flight, the engineer said, and his voice cracked. Aurora 1 is in the corridor. Center of the corridor. They are going to make it. They are going to make it. The floor did not erupt yet, because there was one more thing. The worst thing. The thing every flight controller dreads. Re-entry blackout. When a spacecraft comes screaming back into the atmosphere, the heat builds a sheath of superheated plasma around it that radio waves cannot cut through. For a few minutes, you lose all contact. The crew is in there, riding a fireball down through the sky at 25 times the speed of sound. And you cannot hear them, and they cannot hear you. And all you can do is sit in your clean Brent's cool room and stare at a clock and wait to find out whether the people you sent into the fire are going to come out the other side. Sims's last words before the blackout came over the loop. Calm as ever, with something underneath it now. That was not fear. It was gratitude. Flight. Aurora 1. We are entering blackout. Whoever ran that solution. Thank you. Tell them thank you. See you on the other side. And then static. And then nothing. 4 minutes of nothing. I want you to understand what 4 minutes of nothing feels like in that room. 40 people who built their whole lives around controlling things. And for 4 minutes, there is nothing left to control. Nothing left to compute. No problem left to solve. Just 3 names hanging in a silence. And a clock that will not move faster, no matter how hard you stare at it. Devon Price had his hands pressed together in front of his mouth. The 2 veteran engineers were perfectly still. Kate Mercer stood at the center of the room, with her arms crossed, and her jaw set, and her eyes shining. And she did not say a word. And Jalen Brooks sat at that console, 16 years old, his grandfather's slide rule in his pocket. And he watched the clock count up through the silence. And he prayed the second prayer of his life. And this one was just one word. Over and over. Please. 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 3 minutes. 3 minutes. 30. 4 minutes. And then, through the static, faint, breaking up, the most beautiful sound any of them had ever heard. Commander Yvette. Sims's voice came back from the other side of the fire. Flight. Aurora 1. We are through blackout. Drogue chutes are out. We have 3 good chutes. 3 souls aboard. All in good condition. We are coming home. Now the room erupted. It was not the polite applause of people who are supposed to clap. It was the other thing. The real thing. 40 trained. Disciplined. Buttoned-up flight professionals came out of their chairs at the same instant and made a sound like a wave breaking. People were yelling. People were hugging strangers. The new dad jokes about Holt's baby were suddenly funny in a way that put grown engineers in tears. Devon Price grabbed Jalen by both shoulders and was shaking him and saying, "You did it. You did it. You did it." And his face was wet and he did not care. The two veteran engineers who had checked every line of Jalen's work, men with 20, 30 years in that room, they were shaking the boy's hand and not letting go. One of them saying, over and over, "Where did you come from? So, where on earth did you come from?" And Jalen Brooks did not celebrate. He sat there at the console, in the middle of all that noise, and he did not smile, and he did not pump his fist, and he did not say a word. He put his hand flat against his shirt pocket, where the slide rule was, and he closed his eyes, and 2 tears ran down his face. And the only thing in his mind, in that whole roaring room, it was an old man at a kitchen table in the projects in Gary, Indiana, who had filled notebooks with this exact kind of math 60 years ago, and been told he was not a certain kind of person. Grandpa, he thought, I stood in the room, and they lived, up on the loop. The splashdown call came in. Aurora 1 was in the water. The recovery teams were moving. 3 people who had been minutes from dying were bobbing safely in the ocean under 3 good parachutes. Alive. Because of a sequence of numbers that had been worked out by a boy, the lead engineer had told to stand behind the rope and keep his mouth shut. And speaking of that lead engineer, in the middle of all that noise, there was one person on the floor who was not cheering. Preston Vance was standing exactly where Kate Mercer had told him to step aside, and he was staring at the board, at the corridor display, at Aurora 1's path, dead center in the window. His face had gone the color of ash, and his eyes were moving across Jalen's split-burn solution, still up on the screen, checking it again. The way a man checks a thing, he desperately needs to be wrong. He was looking for the mistake. There was no mistake. The boy's work was perfect. It was, the engineers would later confirm in writing, more efficient and more robust than anything Meridian's own systems and Meridian's own experts had produced. The mascot behind the rope had not just matched the room. He had beaten it, and he had done it after. That same room laughed at his warning, dismissed his answer, watched its computer crash, and very nearly let 3 people die rather than listen to him. Preston Vance stood there and watched the proof of all of that, glowing on a screen, in front of 40, cheering people, and something in his face came apart. Have you ever watched a man's entire understanding of who deserves to be in the room collapse? In real time, with the receipts up on the wall where everyone can see, the cheering settled. Eventually, the way it has to, the recovery operation took over. And in the strange, flat, quiet that comes after a near disaster, when everyone is too wrung out to keep celebrating, and the enormity of what almost happened starts to set in, Kate Mercer walked to the center of the floor. She did not need to raise her voice. She got quieter, and the room leaned in, the way it always did. In about an hour, she said, there are going to be reporters in this building, and executives, and probably a senator or 2. And they are all going to want to tell the story of how Meridian Aerospace brought a crew home from a debris strike. And I want every person in this room to be very clear, before any of that starts, about what actually happened here today. So I am going to say it once, with the loop recording, so it is on the record forever. She turned and looked at Jalen. Mr. Brooks, stand up, please. He stood, 16 years old, cheap shirt, slide rule in his pocket, in the middle of the most important room in American spaceflight. This crew is alive, Kate Mercer said, because of you, not because of our software, which failed and then crashed. Not because of our procedures, which did not cover this, because a 16-year-old guest, who we told to stand behind the rope, solved a problem that the most experienced flight dynamics team in this country could not solve. In the time we had, and he did it after we dismissed his warning about the very debris that caused this. I want that on the record. I want it on the record that this company nearly killed 3 astronauts. Because some of us decided we already knew what this young man was worth, before we ever let him open his mouth. The room was dead silent, and every eye in it, slowly, turned toward Preston Vance. Mercer turned too. She walked over to where he was standing. "Preston," she said, very quietly, "you are going to want to look at the board." He did not move. "Preston, is the solution valid?" The whole floor held its breath. It was the question. Was it not? The only question. Not whether the kid was likable. Not whether he had the right degree. Not whether he came from the right kind of neighborhood. Just, is the solution valid? Vance stared at the corridor display, at the dead center path, at the perfect, elegant, fuel-saving split burn that a boy from the projects in Gary, Indiana, had worked out in his head. In the time it took Vance's $100 million software to fail 3 times and then die, and Preston Vance, who had built his entire self around the idea that the people in his room were the best, and the people outside it deserved to be outside it. Preston Vance opened his mouth, and what came out was pulled through his teeth. Like each word, cost him a year of his life. The approach is unorthodox, a long breath, but the result is correct. The solution is valid. It is better than ours. Kate Mercer nodded. "Wentz, thank you." "Preston, the flight record will reflect that Mr. Jalen Brooks computed the corrected deorbit solution that returned the Aurora 1 crew safely to Earth, and that the solution was independently verified as valid and superior by senior flight dynamics staff." She let that sit, and then she said the part that turned a personal moment into something bigger. The part these stories are really about, because it is never just about one bad man getting his comeuppance. It is about the system that built him, and the system that has to change, and there is going to be a review. Kate Mercer said, "Not just of today's failure, of how we got here, of the fact that this young man identified the debris risk before undock, and was laughed off this floor, of how many other warnings, from how many other people we had already decided did not count. I got waved away in this building, because of who they came from, instead of what they said. We are going to look at all of it, because a room that cannot hear the right answer from the wrong-looking person is a room that is going to get people killed. It almost did. Today, and I am done pretending that is an acceptable risk." Preston Vance was relieved of flight operations duty, pending a full review, and the investigation did not stop with the dismissed debris warning. It pulled the thread Mercer had pointed at, and behind that thread was a pattern. Years long, junior engineers, contractors, people from state schools and community colleges and outreach programs, whose correct calls had been overruled, whose ideas had quietly resurfaced later under other names, whose careers had stalled in Vance's shadow, while less talented people from the right schools advanced. It was all there. Once somebody finally looked. The man's merit had been a turnstile that only spun one way. He did not go to prison. This is not that kind of story. But he never ran a flight again. And the closed loop he had built his whole identity around, the one that made everyone inside the room a genius, and everyone outside it deservedly out. That loop got broken open, in front of the entire company, with the receipts on the wall, by the work of a 16-year-old he had told to keep quiet. Have you ever watched the word merit get handed back to a man who had been hiding behind it his whole life, and watched him finally understand that he had never actually known what it meant. Now here is where I could end it. The crew is home. The kid is a hero. The gatekeeper is exposed. Roll credits. But that is not how the stories that matter end. And it is not how this one ends either. Because punishing one bad man does not fix the room. And the whole point, the thing Kate Mercer understood, is that the room has to change. Or the next brilliant kid behind the next rope gets laughed off the floor too. And maybe that time, nobody walks back in and says, "Let the kid talk." And maybe that time, 3 people do not come home, so they change the room. Meridian Aerospace did something most companies only ever pretend to do. They actually looked at the gap between believing in the next generation on a brochure and believing it in a room. When a crisis is on the clock, and they tried to close it, they wrote a new rule into the flight protocol. Kate Mercer pushed it through personally, and inside the company, they ended up calling it the Brooks Rule, though Jalen always hated that, and would tell you it should be named after Devon Price, who actually carried the answer up the line. The rule was simple. In any anomaly, any safety call, the source of a correct technical observation is irrelevant to its evaluation. You check the math, not the badge. A flag from an intern gets run down with exactly the same rigor as a flag from a flight director. Every voice in the room, no exceptions. They built it into the training. They built it into the culture because they had learned the hardest possible way that a single dismissed warning from a single dismissed person had cost them everything but luck, and they did not stop at the rule. They turned the Holloway guest program from what it had been, a photo op, a kid behind a rope, exactly what Vance had accused it of being, into something real, a genuine pipeline, paid fellowships, actual mentorship from actual engineers, a path with money and structure behind it, for kids from the places this country usually decides not to look. The Garys, and the South Sides, and the forgotten steel towns, to walk all the way from a library computer to a console on the floor, not as mascots, as engineers. The first fellowship they created, fully funded, 4 years of tuition, plus a guaranteed position at Meridian when he was ready, with Kate Mercer herself as his mentor. That one had a name on it already, Jalen Brooks. He did not have to wonder anymore whether he would lose his shot. He did not have to ride a bus back to a school with no advanced classes and teach himself out of library books by the light of a cracked phone. The door that had been bolted against his grandfather for 50 years was not just open now. It had his name carved over it. And there was more. Because when a 16-year-old solves a crude re-entry on live telemetry, the whole world finds out fast. The National Space Agency reached out within 48 hours. 2 universities you have definitely heard of called the apartment in Gary. There were offers, real loans, the kind that change a life, and a family, and a bloodline. Yalen, being Jalen, being Walter's grandson, took his time with all of it. Talk to your family. People kept telling him, and he did. He talked to the one person whose opinion had ever actually mattered. Which brings me to the part of this story I have been saving. The part that matters most, because this was never really about a spacecraft. It was about an old man at a kitchen table. And the sky he was never allowed to touch. Walter Brooks had watched the whole thing on the news. In that 3rd-floor apartment in Gary, with the radiator knocking and his bad heart doing things it was not supposed to do, he had seen the crawl across the bottom of the screen first. Crude capsule strikes debris. Crew in danger. And his blood had gone to ice. because his grandson was in that building. And then, slowly, over the next hour, as the story came together on every channel, Walter Brooks watched the impossible thing assemble itself in front of him, that the crew had been saved, that they had been saved by a 16-year-old guest, that the 16-year-old guest was named Jalen Brooks, of Gary, Indiana. Walter sat alone in that apartment and watched his grandson's name on the national news, under the words hero and prodigy, and the footage of and the old man, the man who had filled notebooks with this exact math in 1961 and been handed a broom, the man who had spent 40 years cutting other men's designs out of metal, the man who had carried it as just how it is around in his chest like shrapnel for half a century. That old man put his face in his hands, and he wept, in a way he had not let himself weep in his entire life, not because it was sad, because it was finished, because the thing that had been done to him, the door that had been closed on him, the dream that had been taken from him, it had finally been answered. Not by an apology. Nobody ever apologized to Walter Brooks. By something better. By his own blood. Walking through that exact door. And saving 3 lives. In the exact room they had kept him out of. In front of the whole watching world. When Jalen came home, the company flew him. First class. A kid who had never been on a plane. They brought him home to Gary. And a car took him to that 3rd-floor apartment. And he came up those 3 flights 2 at a time. And his grandfather was standing in the doorway waiting for him. With the door open, and the light behind him, neither of them could talk for a minute. They just held on to each other in that doorway. The old man and the boy. And the old man kept saying one thing into the boy's shoulder. Over and over. The same thing he had said when the Holloway letter came. Except now it meant everything. You stood in the room. You stood in the room. You stood in the room. And then Jalen stepped back. And he reached into his shirt pocket. And he took out the slide rule. The holy thing. He had carried it the whole time. He had had his hand on it in the worst 4 minutes of his life. And he held it out to his grandfather. And he said, "It was in my pocket the whole time. Grandpa, when I ran the burn, it was right there. So it was not just me in that room. It was you too. You were in there with me. It was always supposed to be you. I just got to carry you in." Walter Brooks looked at that slide rule in his grandson's hand. The same slide rule he had bought used in 1962. With money he had saved sweeping floors at a company that would not let him design so much as a bolt. And he understood that the boy was right. That a piece of him had finally made it into the room. That the dream they took from him 60 years ago had not died on that factory floor. It had just been waiting for a kid with the same furnace in his head. And a country that, almost by accident, had left enough free knowledge lying around for a poor boy to reach. He closed Jalen's fingers back around the slide rule. "No, baby," he said. "You keep it. You are not done carrying it yet. You have got a long way to go, and a lot of rooms to stand in. And every one of them, every single one of them, you walk in like you were always supposed to be there. Because you were. We both were. We always were. Have you ever watched a debt that a country owed for 60 years finally get paid, not with money? And not with an apology, but with a grandson, standing in the exact room they kept his grandfather out of, and bringing 3 people home alive. Let me sit with you for 1 second before I let you go. Because this story is about more than one brilliant kid. And one good day. Preston Vance was not a stupid man. I keep saying that because it is important. He was not a cartoon villain twirling a mustache. He was a smart, accomplished, credentialed man who had built his whole understanding of the world around a comfortable lie The lie that the people inside the room were inside because they were the best, and the people outside it were outside because they were not. And that lie feels like merit. It feels like standards. It feels like fairness. That is what makes it so dangerous. Because the moment you believe it all the way down, you stop being able to hear the right answer when it comes out of the wrong-looking mouth. You will laugh off the warning. You will refuse to read the homework. You will, if it comes to it, let 3 people fall out of the sky. Rather than admit the kid behind the rope was smarter than you. That is not a flaw in one man. That is a flaw in a whole way of deciding who counts. And this country has been running that flaw for a very, very long time. So here is the question I want to leave you with. The real one. The one this whole story is actually asking. How many Walter Brookses did we have? How many brilliant minds? How many people who could do orbital math in their heads? Who could have designed the things that flew? Who could have cured something? Built something? Saved someone? How many of them did this country hand a broom to and tell, you are not a certain kind of person? How much genius have we thrown in the trash because it showed up in the wrong skin, in the wrong neighborhood, in the wrong shirt? How many 3 people falling out of the sky moments did we lose? Not because the answer did not exist, but because the person who had it was standing behind a rope we built. And nobody ever said, let them talk. We will never know the number. That is the tragedy of it. The Walter Brookses of America did not get a news crawl, and a fellowship, and a doorway scene. Most of them just got the broom, and the floor, and 40 years, and a piece of shrapnel in the chest that they carried quietly to the grave. We never even found out what we missed. We threw away the answer before we ever heard the question. Jalen Brooks got through. Barely. By luck. A free library computer. A cheap laptop. A pile of knowledge somebody happened to leave lying around. An old man who refused to let the dream die. And one flight director. In one room. On one day. Who was willing to say 5 words. Bring him to the desk. That is how thin the margin was. Between a hero and another wasted genius. 5 words. One person willing to check the math instead of the badge. The whole job. The only job, really, is to be the person who says, let the kid talk. To check the math. Not the messenger. To remember that the answer does not care what school you went to, or what neighborhood raised you, or what color hand is holding the pencil, and that a room which cannot hear the truth from the wrong-looking person is a room that is, sooner or later, I'm going to get somebody killed. Jalen Brooks did not walk into that control room to prove anyone wrong. He walked in to prove something to himself, that the mind his grandfather had lit at a kitchen table, the mind he had built in library corners, and on bus rides, and on a laptop with a crack across the screen, was real, that it counted. And when that room finally went quiet and listened to him, it was not because the answer surprised them. The answer had been sitting in his head the whole time. Finished. While they failed, they went quiet because they were ashamed. It had taken them so long to listen. So do not make a Walter Brooks. Not at your job. Not in your school. Not in your own head. The next genius this country needs might be standing behind a rope right now, in a cheap shirt, with the answer already worked out, waiting for one person to be brave enough to say, let them talk. Be that person. If this story moved you, if you have ever been the one nobody believed in, the one they told to stand behind the rope and keep quiet, while you held the answer in your hands, drop a comment below and tell me your story. I read them. I read all of them. And if you know somebody who needs to hear this tonight, a kid with a furnace in their head, and nobody backing them, and old Walter Brooks who never got their door. Send this to them. Right now, subscribe to Witness. Because talent does not wait for permission, and neither should you. This has been Calvin Boone. I will see you in the next one.